telling me. Okay. Okay, I hope this is better. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Warren just called me to tell me that I was muted.
Okay. All good.
All right, sorry about that, guys. Okay. Oh yeah, I see someone was on the chat. Okay. Okay. So just to respond, Ron, to what you were saying is yeah, there are many more institutions, and you could take that to mean one of two different things: either that there's a greater sense of urgency to fulfill this mitzvah, or that even if I do tithe my income, it's really, I shouldn't say tithe your assets, it's tithe your income. As we'll see, it's your new income that comes in every year should be tithed. Even if I tithe my income, I'll never be able to fully support all of the institutions that need my support. You could make that argument too. Okay, so let's see. Let us continue. We haven't learned anything about prioritization or anything about that yet. Abirke Yosef Kosav Shemaiser Ksafim Huchiyev Gomer Midrabanan Ulam Nahagu Ha'olam Lahakel Bo Mekivan Shemi Iker Hadin Mutter Linakot Me'amaiser Otsaos Banav Shemi Al Gil Sheish. Birke Yosef writes an interesting idea. I think he lives in the 18th century, and he writes that tithing your income is a mitzvah derabanan. He says unequivocally that. Why are people sometimes lenient? People are lenient because they typically deduct from Meiser Ksafim their children's educational costs. And not only educational costs, but supporting your children. Just supporting, giving them, buying them food. Once a child reaches the age of 6, al pi halacha, you have no longer an obligation to support them anymore. You can basically show them the door and say, no, I tell you, and you can say, adios, amigo. You know, you're on your own, kiddo. Get a job. But Daddy, I'm only 6. Yeah, well, that's what the shulchan. That's the halacha. So the fact that you support your children to the tune of, typically over the course of a year, it's tens of thousands of dollars, and that really does eat up pretty much almost all of your meiser ksafim of you certainly, when a person's raising a family, they certainly spend more than 10% of their income on their children who are over 6 years old. And because of that, that's the reason why people are lenient. And in most cases, that's even more than 10% of your income. He also writes that if you're blessed with more means, and you can tithe your income in addition to the amount that you pay to support your children, that is the proper thing to do. Ulamaisa, b'nei Sfarad tzrichim linho kehabirkei Yosef mikiven shekiblu aleim horaotav. Sephardic Jews have always accepted the Piskei Halacha of the Birkei Yosef, and therefore that's certainly how they should comport themselves. Daled. Now, so there's one opinion that you're obligated to tithe. There's another opinion that you're not obligated, but according to that opinion, if you would like to be machmir and tithe, nechleku haposkim legabe ani im chayv b'maiser. Then there's a machlokas among the poskim whether a poor person must tithe the tzedakah that is given to him. Yesh misha omer shemisha mugdar ka'ani, dahainu she'en lo sikum kesef hamaspik lo kedei michyato l'shana echat. There is an opinion that says that if someone is halachically qualifies as poor, which means that he doesn't have enough money to support himself for one full year, That's as we'll see, we're going to define an ani more carefully, but that's the preliminary definition of an ani. I don't have enough money to cover myself for the entire year. If, according to that definition, if I don't, if let's say my business closed and I don't know if I'm going to make it through the year, then I qualify as an ani, right? So vegam ein lo maskoret chodshit shemaspika l'chol tzrachav. And furthermore, even if a person has a job, but he doesn't have enough salary to cover all of his needs, that also qualifies him as an ani. So pater mi ma'aser. So there's an opinion that says that such a person is pater from tithing. In other words, even according to the opinion that you're obligated to tithe midrabanan, a person who can't cover his essential living expenses is exempt from meiser. Ulam hu chayev b'tzedaka kifi yecholto v'lo yitain pachot mishlish hashekel l'shana kamo shenizkar le'el. He's still obligated in the mitzvah of tzedakah, right? And he has to give a minimus of a third of a shekel per year, which is like $3. Okay, so that's his minimal obligation. V'yesh mi she'omer she'afilu ani chayav b'ma'aser, and some say that even a poor person has to tithe his income. V'rak misha matzavo dachuk biyoter v'im yitain ma'aser yiyu chasirim lo tzrachim hachrei chiyim. He says it's only if by tithing, let's say taking 10% of his income, he's going to be out of basic living. He won't be able to cover his rent. He won't be able to pay his utility bills. And if I give tzedakah, I'll have to accept tzedakah. In other words, it's a common question. Should I apply for tuition subsidy so that I can give tzedakah? So that intuitively, I think you all understand, that doesn't really make any sense. You're better off paying full tuition and not giving and not tithing than saying, no, well, I have to tithe. I have to give to this kollel and to that yeshiva and to this cause and to that. What? And that for that reason, you're going to apply for a subsidy? That doesn't make sense. Because that basically applying for a subsidy means you're accepting tzedakah. So ein tzarech laseis ma'aser ela yikach la'atzmo et kesef masrotav. You don't have to tithe, and instead take the tithe for yourself. He's quoting the Tshuvas V'Hanhagos Rav Schnernbach, the Shem Agriz. Not sure if that's the Brisker Rav. I'm not sure. He writes, "Kol misha matzavo dachuk ad shezakuk la'azara me'acherim ve'eno chai b'motarot klal." He says if a person is very tight in his income, where to the point where he really is dependent on others to help supplement his income, does not live with excesses, doesn't live with luxuries. He's exempt from tithing. Okay. V'yesh misha omer da'af debazeh pater midina mikol makom lo yimno minasinas meiser. He says, but there's even an opinion that in that kind of situation, where a person just has enough to get by, he still should not refrain from tithing. Because he says, if you end up keeping the stuff that you could have tithed, it'll end up going to doctor bills and other things that'll break, like a pipe will break. In other words, this is a theological pronouncement, is that if you don't tithe, you're going to end up spending the money that you didn't use for tithing for things that you might not have needed to do anyway. And what's recommended by some poskim, who's he quoting here? He's quoting the Tshuvas V'Hanhagos, right? What's really a good thing to do, those years where you can't really tithe, write down what you wanted to give, the amount of your income that really was 10% and you wish you could have given, put it away somewhere, and when God blesses you with a lot of money, you'll pay that back. V'yesh misha omer shafilu misheinu mugdar ka'ani aval matzavo dachuk. There's an opinion that states that even if you don't qualify technically as an ani, because let's say you have a savings, you just don't want to touch that savings because you want to keep it for your retirement or whatever it is, or you want to use it for a down payment on a house. But at the same time, you're barely able to cover your living expenses. You don't want to go into that principle that you're saving to be able to afford a down payment. And so therefore, even if you end up tithing, you won't need to accept tzedakah. But if you tithe, you're going to have to live with a lot less than what you're used to living. You'll have to demote your standard of living. Then too, you would be exempt from tithing. And so that's a very lenient position, and it's also very subjective, right? He's quoting Rav Elyashiv over here. Rav Elyashiv says, let's say a person's used to a certain standard of living. If by tithing his income, he's going to have to do without, let's say he's used to leasing a new car every 3 years. And he can either do that or he can tithe and buy a clunker. Okay? So this would argue that if your standard of living is to always have a car of a higher quality, but if you tithe, you'll have to get a not such a nice car, or perhaps use your bicycle instead of using a car. So then you'd be exempt in that situation as well. So that's a very lenient opinion.
You have an RSP, right? And the RSP is growing. You're not touching this for years, so it's growing in your account. But that could be significant money that you're going to have to give each year, let's say, in the later years, before you're ready to touch RSP, because it's growing in the account. So are you obligated to pay on that RSP that's growing that you're not touching?
You mean, do you include that as part of your tithing?
Yeah.
Is that part of your income? It's a good question. We'll have to see. It's certainly not taxable right away. So maybe you could argue that if it's not taxable, it's not part of your income, but we'll see. Okay. Bachur yeshiva shemakelet tzrachav min hahorim o min hayeshiva yesh mi sheposek she'eno begeder ani u'memela chayev b'maaser. A yeshiva bacher who's supported by his parents or is supported by the yeshiva with a regular stipend. Some say that he does not qualify as an ani because he's supported by another party, so he's always got that safety net, and therefore whatever income he does bring in, let's say he gets a summer job, even though that summer job is not enough to support him for the year, he still has to tithe because he's not an ani. He'll always be supported by his parents. Got a roof over his head, he's got food in his belly, he's got clothes on his back because his parents cover all of his expenses, so he doesn't qualify as an ani. Others disagree that if you're not earning enough money to support yourself, then you do qualify as an ani. And therefore, we saw machlokas is an ani obligated in tithing. And if by that argument, it could be that a yeshiva bacher, any boy or girl who's still dependent on their parent, would be patur from meiser according to some opinions and obligated according to others. V'yesh mi sheposek she'im aviv nosein lo bishvil dvarim mesuyamim, az yachol liot she'ein haben sarich latet ma'aser mima shekibel me'aviv. Now, as far as let's say your parents give you an allowance, but they give you an allowance to cover your expenses for specific things. And this is something that we're going to see recurring, is that if a person gives you a certain amount of cash and they say, with this cash, I want you to buy yourself your regular meals, and I want you to buy clothes with that cash. Then you don't tithe that amount of cash that a father gives you, right? Avolim ha'avnos in lo kesef stam. But let's say your father gives you an allowance and says, do with it whatever you want. So then chayav haben latet maaser. Then if a person gets a cash gift and the father says, do with it whatever you want, so then the son would be obligated to tie that. And he says, we're going to talk about this later on. But it's always that way. Look, when you tithe your money and then you pay your employees, right? Doesn't exempt your employees from having to tithe. Okay. Halva'a shehi litzarach chotzos habayis ratzui lahafrish mimena meiser miyad kishem. He says, if a person takes out a loan, then it's a wonderful thing to tithe even money that you borrow. And then when you pay it back, that money would be exempt from tithing to the person who lent you the money. But you don't tithe a loan that is for a business loan, because you need that money for the business. But if it's just for house expenses, then it's advisable, he says. Quoting Rav Auerbach, Rav Shlomo Zalman. I don't understand the rationale behind that, because I would argue that if you are so stretched that you need to take a loan, why would you tithe that? So I don't really understand this. Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me, I would say. Okay, Tess. Im ani mevakesh mimenu tzedakah ve'ein lo, eno chayv lilvos kedei lases lo. If a poor person asks you for tzedakah and you don't have it, you're not obligated to borrow money in order to fulfill the mitzvah of tzedakah. Avalim ein lo kesef bekiso ve'yesh lo kesef beveso, chayv lilvos kedei lases tzedakah lani. But if you have money, you just don't have money on you, and you're at minyan, and the guy says, can you give me tzedakah? So then you're supposed to borrow money from others in order to fulfill the mitzvah. Okay? And that also is not something that I've seen people regularly be makbid. A guy walks into shul and asks everyone for tzedakah, and you don't have any coins in your pocket. You're not mechuyev to borrow money. You can say, I'm sorry, I don't have anything on me. That's a very regular occurrence. Okay, so that concludes Siman Beis, who is obligated to give tzedakah. Let's go on to the next. Mimi ra'ui lekabla, from whom may we accept tzedakah? Okay, so we saw the whole idea about a married woman. Remember that whole thing we saw in Choshen Mishpat. There's a whole shaila whether you can accept tzedakah from a married woman, because maybe she's taking money from her husband's account against her husband's wishes. So, meisha nesua shenosenes mikesef baila, umiyaladim shenostim mikesef orehem, ein mekablim tzedakah ela davar muat velo gadol. So the first rule is, if a woman is married, or if children are giving money that you know is coming from their parents and is not theirs, you can only accept small donations, not large donations, because you don't know. Maybe they're committing theft. And what is defined as a small amount versus a large amount? It's all relative, dependent upon the financial bracket of the people you're dealing with. You know, if you go to Richie Rich remember Richie Rich? If you go to Richie Rich for an adava, right, and he gives you $1,000, that's a small amount, okay? But if you go to, let's say, someone in Thornhill, and you knock on the door and say, I'd like some tzedakah, please, and a child says, oh, let me go to my parents' stash and they give you $1,000, so that would be usher. That would be usher. Okay. If a child gives you a $5 bill, then you can assume that the parent gave them permission, or a $10 bill. You can assume the parent said, if someone comes to the door, you can give them this amount of money. Obviously, when we say that you don't accept from a married woman, we're talking about women who themselves are not involved in commerce, right? They're completely dependent on their husbands and their domestic housewives. All right, we'll hold it here. We'll conclude Imrei Hashem tomorrow. Just as a reminder, tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh, so we'll learn a shorter amount of time. Okay, take care, everybody.